If you're curious about this wonderful hobby and artist tool we call an airbrush, but don't know where to start, you may want to stick around for the basics. Welcome back to Crafted by Metamorphic Custom. There's plenty of great airbrush video tutorials out there in YouTube land, but in this particular video that I'm making, I want to try to take you through all of the basics, not only how to use the airbrush and why you're selecting this particular one if you are, but also how to clean it, how to select a compressor and what compressor I use, and how to take it apart and put it back together, which is hard to find in one video, so hopefully this video helps. Speaking of, this is the airbrush I use. I've got a few, but this is my workhorse. This is the Badger Patriot, which is a double action airbrush. As you can see, if you press down, that releases air, but not paint. And if you pull back, as so, that releases the paint, but not air. So in order to operate this airbrush, you gotta first push down all the way gradually, and then pull back to release the paint. I find double action airbrushes are easier to control, or I should say you have more control over, and it's a great airbrush to start with. This is a gravity fed airbrush. That's why the reservoir is there on the top rather than at the bottom. At the bottom that would be siphon fed. Again, this is at the top, so this is a gravity fed. The Badger airbrush, that Badger Patriot airbrush, is a very, very common model. And if you take a quick video up close here, you can probably see the needle moving in and out. And that's what moving the trigger back and forth does. It releases paint by moving the needle back and forth. It moves the needle back, releasing the paint out through the front of the airbrush. But before we go any further, no one ever talks about their compressor. You can't work an airbrush without an air compressor. Now, this is the one I use, which is the Master brand, and you can see, I'm taking a close-up here so you can see the exact model that I use. And that's the TC40T. You could get a different brand, a different size, but this is the one I use. Pretty good intro brand, but sturdy. I've been using this for 3 years. It comes with an air regulator and a moisture trap there on the right-hand side of your screen. It also tells you the PSI there. That's the regulator. On and off switch at the top. Little carrying handle, and it's a pretty sturdy airbrush. I've been using it almost on an everyday basis for 2.5 years now with no problem, no signs of wearing out. And here's the hose that comes attached to it. This actually came with this particular air compressor, and it feeds directly or attaches directly to the bottom of the airbrush, like so. And can you get another model airbrush and another model compressor? You sure can, but these are the ones that I use, and I think these are great for beginners. Good, sturdy airbrush and compressor, and again, great for beginners. And what I'm doing here is I'm just pressing down on the handle, no paint in the brush, just showing you how the air actually goes through the handle. If I press back, nothing's gonna happen because there's no paint yet. But speaking of paint, what are some great paints to learn with? Nobody ever teaches you that. I'm going to start with FW inks and some Vallejo Air model paint. Two very different brands and two very different types of paints. The inks on my right hand here, I'm just using a blue color, no particular reason. And the red Vallejo Game Air series on my left. The one on my left is specifically made for airbrushing, hence the name Air. But the reason I'm going to start off with the ink on what's previously on my right hand, it's this blue FW ink, is because inks are so easy to airbrush. Also, I'm also starting off with this because the one tip I've always heard, and maybe you've heard if you've just started looking at airbrushing, is how to mix the airbrush paint, or how to mix paints so that they're ready for your airbrush. And they always say, well, mix it to the consistency of milk, which is actually correct, but do they tell you whole milk? Is it 2% milk? Is it skim milk? It can get kind of confusing, right? So learning with inks, you can't go wrong, especially just getting some practice in. Speaking of, that's exactly what I'm doing here. This is a great way to start. I'm using a scrap piece of foam board for no other reason than it's a scrap piece that was lying around. And I'm using just the FW ink, no thinning whatsoever, and I'm just slowly pressing the trigger down while also gently pulling it back. Remember, pressing it down releases air, and pulling it back releases the paint. The air will then take the paint out through the front of the airbrush, and you are now airbrushing. And you can get some pretty fine lines or pretty thick lines, depending on how close you are to the surface of what you're painting, or how much you push down or pull back the trigger. It's just a combination. Pull back too much, you get this wild streaking effect, which is basically the wrong way to do it unless you're trying to go for some weird weathering pattern, which I sometimes do, but for the most part, stay away from this when you're practicing. And do make sure to practice. This will be very important the first time you're using an airbrush. Use these inks. They'll give you a great idea of how much to push down, how much to pull back on the trigger, how far away you need to be from the surface. Just a great way to know how the paint flows through the airbrush based on your operation of the trigger. So don't forget to do this before you actually start painting anything you care about. Speaking of, before we switch paints, how do we actually clean out the airbrush, make sure that all the previous paint is out? Well, different people use different solutions. I use Simple Green. Specifically, I mix it 1-to-1 with water. So half Simple Green, half water. And I use this between each of my colors to clean out my airbrush before I go to the next color. And speaking of color, we're now going to that Vallejo Air color, Game Air, to be specific. This is just a red color. I believe this is Scarlet, or is it a bloody red? I'm not sure. That's not the point. The point is, this particular brand of colors was specifically formulated for use in an airbrush. Still, this is going to be thicker paint than that FW ink. Inks are always thinner. They can be used for washing or filtering. I won't get into the specifics of that, but the point is, even this paint that was specifically formulated for use through an airbrush is a little thicker. Point being, although it's thicker, you shouldn't have to dilute it. Some people choose to, sometimes I even do so, but you should be able to use it in a basic airbrush like this Badger Patriot without thinning and without diluting. Let's go back to FW inks for a second, not for any other reason than to show you this sepia color. And I'm showing you this because this is the sepia color I use in almost every one of my videos and all the dioramas I've built. I think most of them have the sepia color. It's one of my favorite colors that I use through an airbrush to tint my dioramas, to tint any kind of plaster wall, or just make things look dirtier, grimy, or just give it a shade. From natural rocks to, again, plaster walls like I mentioned before. This is a great color, and you can get some pretty nice, believable grading effects, as you can see there. Switching colors again. Going to my Simple Green and water mix, just putting it in my airbrush. Might want to get a brush there, make sure I clean out that reservoir there at the top, make sure nothing's sticking to the sides there. Just go back and forth. And then when I'm done, I'll pour that out into a cup or into a glass jar. This is just trash, really. And before I go forward, I want to make sure that there's no color there. If there's still, sepia in this case, I'll go again. I'll do the same exact thing. I'll put some of this cleaning solution, the Simple Green and water mix, hit it with a brush in there. Also maybe brush out the tip gently. You don't want to bend that needle. Very important. And then once again, when I'm done here, I'll pour this out and I'll make sure that there's no brown color coming through. As you can see, it's just a slight hint of green. That's because of Simple Green. Well, it's green, but there's no brown paint coming out, so that is great. Good to go. Now I'm moving over to just some light purple inks, and as you can see, this is what happens really when you're holding it way too close and pressing down on the trigger, or back on the trigger, I should say, way too much. You're letting too much paint out, and it becomes this watery wash mess that you really don't want with an airbrush, unless you're doing some kind of weird weathering effect. I'll always say that. But otherwise, you don't want that. You want to make sure you're you're a significant distance away from your surface. You know, if you're not sure, give it 6 to 12 inches. Maybe start with 12 inches, about a foot away from your painting surface, then get closer. If you start off too close, you get this weird abstract water effect or watercolor painting effect. But what about the opposite? What happens if you use paint that's too thick? This is a dark red, almost brown color that I normally have to thin when I use it. If I don't thin it, if I use it straight through the airbrush, it starts to clog the airbrush, and you start getting this pulsating effect where clearly paint is no longer coming through. Notice I'm holding the airbrush trigger all the way back and all the way down, and now it's just starting to clog. There's barely any paint coming through. It's pulsating. You want to avoid this. This is a pain to have to clean your airbrush, which I now have to do. There's plenty of other paint types too that I'm not addressing here, like solvent-based colors like Tamiya. It's a great brand, but sticking to more of the acrylic water-based paints that I mentioned before, like the inks and the Vallejo colors. I think you should too, because it's easier to dilute paint with water if you need to, and then it's always then easier to move on to solvent-based thinners and paints once you've already practiced with the water-based ones that I've shown. But sometimes, especially at the beginning, you'll get your airbrush so clogged that it won't work unless you completely tear it down and give it a thorough cleaning. And completely tearing it down could be scary, so let's go through that on this Badger Patriot. First, I unscrewed the needle locking nut and removed the needle, and now I'm removing the handle. This back part of this Patriot is called the handle. Just simply unscrew that. Then, now that the needle is completely out, I can remove the trigger by just pulling it up. Now, this trigger has a slot in the middle. That's where the needle goes through. It actually goes through the post of this trigger, and you can see that there is clearly a channel where the needle would pass through. Just to demonstrate, once the trigger is placed back into the airbrush and the needle is placed in through the rear of the airbrush, it would actually go through the trigger post, as you see there. That's important. Later, when we'll rebuild this, which I'll actually go through. And again, the bottom of this post in the trigger is what sits on this button, if you will, this lever all the way at the bottom of the airbrush. And when you press down the trigger, again, that releases the air because it's pushing down on the button, which you don't see. It's all the way on the bottom of the airbrush, and it's very tiny. I want to zoom in a bit to show you this back lever, which I am now removing. This is what really supports the trigger. Once the trigger is in and you pull it back, it pushes this back lever towards the rear. See, that's kind of how the trigger rests within the airbrush, on this back lever. It pushes the back lever towards the back, pretty obvious there. And that's what gets the needle to move back. And this back lever is actually pushing back another component, which is inside the brush. We will get to that. It's actually pushing back the tube shank and the needle tube, so we'll get to that. But this is where the back lever goes into. As you see, it's kind of a T-slot on the top of this Badger Patriot, and that's how this lever is placed in the airbrush, at the top of the T-slot there. But before we talk about reassembly, let's continue with disassembly. Now we're going to pull out or unscrew the tube shank. There's a couple of threads here with different things you can unscrew towards the base or towards the middle of the airbrush. I'm going to start with the thread that is closest to that airbrush casing, the thread that's closest to my left here. That is the tube shank, and I'm going to start unscrewing that until it comes free from the airbrush body. I'm being very gentle here. I don't want to damage anything, although I'm well versed here. Doesn't matter. I always like to take it slow, and this video is not sped up. This is in real time, which is rare for my videos, but again, I want to show you exactly how long this is taking. So unscrewing this tube shank here, and it's finally, there we go. It is released from the airbrush body, and now this component has several more components on the inside, which are integral to the airbrush operation. It's got the needle tube, it's got the spring screw, multiple things are located here. And this is where you can start getting a little bit lost, so feel free to hit reverse on this and rewind this video if need be, if you need to reassemble this particular Badger airbrush. So what I'm going to do here is unscrew another component, which is the spring screw, and that will allow me to remove a few things. And first, let me fully and completely remove the needle screw there. Now remove the spring screw. Now I can push the needle tube out towards the front and remove the spring from inside the tube shank, and as you can see, there is a spring in there. And yes, that's the only spring you'll see here. That is the spring that pushes the needle back towards the front once you release the trigger. And now let's move back to the airbrush body so we can remove the front of the airbrush, the head cap, and the air regulator. The head cap is exactly the part that I am unscrewing right now, and at the very tip, there's the air regulator. And you have to be very careful because inside the head cap here is the nozzle, which actually came out when I unscrewed the head cap. You want to make sure you're not to drop this. You don't want to damage this piece. This is exactly as the name implies. It's the nozzle. The needle feeds through the nozzle, and so does the paint. And the head cap and air regulator in my left hand will go over that and screw into the body of the airbrush. What often gets most clogged, at least for me, is not the head cap or air regulator, but it's that nozzle you saw there. Now that we have this assembled, I'm going to use my needle just as a pointing device here. Being very careful not to damage the needle. This small hole I'm pointing to at the bottom of the front of the airbrush, that's where air gets released. Air comes up through the airbrush, down through a small little tube or cavity, and it comes out of the tip or the front of the airbrush through this tiny little hole. Not the big hole in the center, but the tiny hole at the bottom. And then it goes through the head cap and the air regulator. Thought I should show that. Now, once everything is disassembled as it is in its current state, I'm going to use these pipe cleaners, or specifically airbrush cleaners. I'm just going to go through the different sizes I have available here and just try to gently clean out all the components, especially towards the front. In other words, the head cap, the air regulator, and the nozzle. That's what gets the most clogged. But you can also use that with a cheap ultrasonic cleaner, as I have here. This is what I often use. I think this was maybe 20 or 30 bucks on Amazon, $20 or $30 US, several years ago. And all I do is connect it to the power, pour some water in here. I put all my airbrush components in here, and I just turn it on. And it goes for about 3 minutes, I believe. And I just keep pressing the button. This is just basic water. And the ultrasonic frequencies here, or the vibrations really, are what clean and de-stick or unclog the airbrush components. And I usually do this first. If the airbrush is really clogged, I'll do it to the majority of the components with just water, and that really helps out. It helps to loosen that grime of clogged paint, especially again from the front of the airbrush. Once I do that, I'll then use the pipe cleaners and give it a nice cleaning to make sure all the paint is off. And once it's all dry, it's time for reassembly. Don't panic here. This is nice and easy. Again, rewind the video as you see fit. Again, please take your time. You don't want to damage the components. Again, this is the tube shank, the needle tube, and the spring and spring screw we're going to start off with when we're reassembling the brush. Again, these are the 4 components. So let's pick up this needle tube here, and we're going to insert it into the tube shank. Now there's a specific way to insert it. You see a detent on the tube shank cavity, as well as a flat spot on the tube, on the needle tube. It's pretty obvious. There's only one way it's going to go in, but the point is you're feeding the needle tube through the front of the tube shank here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. Make sure it lines up and goes all the way through and it sits flush there. I'm going to hold it in there because if not, it's going to fall out, but it should slide in and out fairly easily. Then I'll grab the spring, slide it over the tube needle or the needle tube and inside the tube shank. So it is inside the tube shank and the needle tube is inside the spring. So needle tube, spring over it, and then the tube shank, and the spring is inside the tube shank. Then I'll use my spring screw, slide it over, and then you're screwing the spring screw into the tube shank, and that is what holds the spring inside the tube shank. Now I'm still holding the needle tube because if I let it go, well, the spring is going to shoot it forward, right? So I'm holding it in there, and if I let it go, well, it's going to slide right out. Now again, the spring is still in the tube shank. It's held in there by the spring screw, so technically I can just slide this back in there like this. So technically you can put the spring in, the spring screw, then the tube needle or needle tube. I just take you through the assembly method that I used. So once those components are all in there, then I'm going to gently put in the needle screw or the needle nut, whatever you'd like to call it, on the back. I'm not going to screw it all the way in because that'll prevent the needle from going in if I do that. Just kind of present it there. Then I'll take those components and the tube shank will then screw into the airbrush body. I'm going to just screw this all the way in until I hit a wall, and I've stopped. Again, take your time. No reason to hurry it up and possibly cross-thread anything or damage the threads here. You'll want to avoid that, otherwise you'll be buying a new component or even a new airbrush if it gets really bad. So take your time. And I'm just stopping here myself and I'm making sure that everything is still sliding in and out. The needle tube, or again, tube needle, always say it backwards, is still sliding freely and is still pressing up against that spring, no problem. And then I go back to screwing in that tube shank. Now it's pretty much all the way in. And again, working fine. I can still slide that in and out by pulling it. So the spring is still working, nothing's too tight, nothing is wrong here. Everything is technically working as it should. If you reassemble this and the needle doesn't work because the trigger doesn't pull back right, you'll want to come back to those previous steps to make sure you did everything correctly. Now let's move to the front of the airbrush for reassembly. Putting the nozzle in there, that doesn't screw in, that just gently places in the center hole there. Then I'll take the head cap and air regulator and screw it in over the nozzle. And gently screw it in there, making sure the nozzle still is centered in the middle. And that's it, that's pretty easy. Now, the trigger. So we'll take this back lever and the trigger. Remember that the trigger has a slot through its post. Now, the slot has to be oriented so that the needle can slide through that slot in the post of the trigger. So we're going to take the back lever, and remember what I showed you before, the trigger will rest on that back lever and push against that back lever. That is key in pushing back the tube shank, or the needle tube, I should say, that we just put into the back of the airbrush body. So first, we'll get this back lever, and we'll slide it in to the T-slot on the top of the airbrush body. Like so, should slide right in, no problem. Kind of hard to keep it in place, or difficult to make sure it doesn't fall to the side. That you'll just kind of want to manage by, well, just going slowly and placing it in the back there and holding it in place with a hand if need be. But you're going to get that in first to that T-slot, to the top of that T-shaped slot on the back of the top of the airbrush body. And once you have that in place, you can then go ahead and get the trigger. Again, remember to have that slot in the post of the trigger oriented so that it faces the front and rear of the airbrush, so that the needle can slide into that, or in between that airbrush trigger post. I know, a lot of terminology there, but hopefully the images help. So when you're ready, go ahead and get that trigger. slide it into that T-slot at the top of the airbrush body, and it should rest right in the center, where if you push down on that trigger, it will re-engage the airbrush button. I call it the airbrush button at the very bottom of that airbrush, or not the airbrush button, but the button that releases the air. And you'll know because you'll have a spring tension there. If you don't have a spring tension, then you haven't set that trigger down in the correct middle spot. And again, once you've done that, you'll feel that tension, and the back lever can then rest on the back of the trigger. And you can then push it back, and you can see that the trigger is pushing the back lever, and the back lever is pressing or pushing the tube, the needle tube that you've previously inserted. And there's enough pressure there that the trigger won't simply slide out, because that needle tube is pressing the spring, or the spring is pressing the needle tube towards the front and keeping the back lever pressed against the trigger. We'll then get our handle. This back portion is called the handle. Screw that in, and you're almost ready to go once this is in. And then lastly, let's get that needle. Make sure that the needle screw isn't too tight and allows for entry of this needle towards the back of the airbrush and in through the needle tube, and just push all the way through. And this is why it's important to put the trigger in the right way, because otherwise you'll crash into that trigger wall, damaging your needle. You don't want that. And gently push the needle all the way through. At this point, you should see it come out the very front of the airbrush. And when you're ready, go ahead and tighten that needle screw, which will retain the needle in there. Now, make sure that's fairly tight, not too tight, but tight enough to hold the needle in place, so that when you check the airbrush now, it will push back that needle. Again, the trigger will push back the back lever will push back the needle tube, which contains the spring and the needle and everything we've just covered. And just go ahead and depress that. You should see the needle tip at the very front of the airbrush move back and forth, plus you'll see the screw at the back move back and forth along with the needle. And congratulations, you've reassembled your airbrush and learned way too much about the terminology of these airbrush components. If you find you've retained absolutely none of that terminology after watching this, don't worry, that's not the point. The point was to show you the right paints to use, at least to start off, and get through that learning curve, and what it would be like if your airbrush clogged, or what it looks like, or if it's too watery, and how to clean it. Anyways, guys, I hope you liked this video, and until the next one, stay crafted.